All right, so if you're just joining, this is a new Bible study of the book of Esther. We just finished Genesis, and as soon as we finish Esther, we'll be going on to Exodus. But I want to stop here in Esther for the moment and just take a look at what the Bible has to say about a very, very simple question. Does God approve of genocide? And we might read through the book of Joshua and come to one conclusion. We might read through Leviticus and come to a different conclusion. But as we read Esther, this book is really just meant to answer that one simple question. Does God, in fact, approve of genocide? And it happens, the book of Esther happens during the time when Israel had been conquered by Persia, right? They had originally been conquered by Assyria. Then the Persians came in and conquered the Assyrians. Later, the Greeks would come and conquer the Persians, and then the Romans would come and conquer the Greeks. And so Israel would be occupied by a foreign power for a long, long time. In this book, it's always been debated as to whether or not it should even be in the Bible. For one thing, it never mentions God, not once. But for another, there are those who debate whether or not it should be in the Bible because it is totally against the idea of genocide. And it is specifically for the existence of the Jewish people. And so it's had a long and controversial history, as white supremacists have always argued that Esther should not be in the Bible. But I would contend that it is there for a very specific reason. And even without the book of Esther, the Bible says plenty of places that genocide is murder and murder is wrong. But where that message is subtle elsewhere, it is explicit here. So let's take a look at what the book of Esther has to say. The other theme here is one of equality between women and men. And we see that theme run through the scriptures. Now, here it's very important because of the time in history in which it happens, but we see this also in the book of Judges, where if you look to the story of Deborah as a judge, her name is often translated Deborah, wife of Lapidot, right? That would be the name of her husband, Lapidot or Lapidoth. Well, there's something strange about that name. One, it's a woman's name, right? Lapidoth is the name of a woman. But the other thing is, it's not actually a name at all. What it is a title. She is the wife of the flames. She's the greatest of the judges. She leads people into battle. And moreover, she humiliates her enemies. Because the authors of Judges, of the book of Judges, considered that it was shameful that the enemies of Israel subjugated women. They believed that for men to subjugate women made them less of a man. And they considered it humorous. They considered it so shameful that it was humorous, even, that someone would feel the need to do so. And so we see the same theme running through the book of Esther. So I want you to consider these themes, one of genocide and the other of the equality of women, as we read this. Now, if you haven't found the book of Esther yet in your Bible, it's right before the book of Job. If you hit Psalms, you've gone too far. All right, Psalms is right in the middle of your Bible. Esther is going to be before that. So it's after Ezra, Nehemiah, all right, Joshua, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. You've got the Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, then Esther. If you hit Job or the Psalms and Proverbs, you've gone too far. So I think I've bought enough time now for you to find the book of Esther. I've given a bit of an introduction to it. If you have any questions before we start, feel free to type them into the chat on the right, and I'll be happy to answer them. And a reminder that this is the Restoration Church of Christ Bible study on Wednesday nights. We meet at 5 o'clock California time every Wednesday to study God's Word. So here in Esther chapter 1, it says, "Now in the days of Ahasuerus," this is the Ahasuerus who reigned from India even to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So this is the Persian king Ahasuerus. He reigns from India to Ethiopia, not including those two areas, right? So Persia is very close. It borders India. And he reigned all the way to Egypt, right? They conquered Egypt. And Egypt borders Ethiopia. They also conquered Assyria, which borders Greece and Turkey. Well, modern day Turkey, though in those days it would have been Greece. And that, I'm sure, is a bit of a a sore spot for the Turks as well. That actually did used to be Greece. All right. So in those days, Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Susa, the palace. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his princes and his servants, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. He displayed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. When these days were fulfilled, the king made a 7-day feast for all the people who were present in Susa, the palace, both great and small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of white and blue material fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings and marble pillars. The couches were of gold and silver on a pavement of red, white, yellow, and black marble. They gave them drinks in golden vessels of various kinds, including royal wine in abundance, according to the bounty of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had instructed all the officials of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Now, in another translation that I read earlier, it said not to restrict their drinking. In other words, give them as much as they like. Here it's saying the drinking was not compulsory, which makes it sound like they don't have to drink. But of course, it goes on, for the king had instructed all the officials of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. So this is a great banquet. It's set forth in a luxurious setting, and everyone is given as much as they can eat and drink. And it goes on in verse 9, also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, When the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king, wearing the royal crown, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was very beautiful. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by the eunuchs. Therefore, the king was very angry, and his anger burnt in him. Now, it doesn't tell us why she doesn't come, right? Why doesn't she come before the king? Does she think that her station gives her some special privilege? Does she think that she is so loved by the king that even if she defies him, he'll do nothing? Or what does she think of the king? It doesn't tell us, but it does tell us how the king reacts. In verse 13, then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for it was the king's custom to consult those who knew law and judgment. And next to him were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she has not done the bidding of the king Ahasuerus by the eunuchs? Memucan answered before the king and his princes, Vashti the queen has not done wrong just to the king, but also to all the princes and to all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will become known to all women, causing them to show contempt for their husbands when it is reported King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she didn't come. Today the princes of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's deed, will tell all the king's princes. This will cause much contempt and wrath. So, why is the king upset? Because he has lost control over his queen. And this really is in stark contrast to what we see in Judges, right? That women are unequivocally, that they are equal to men in every way. And here, the princes argue to the king, no, women are to be subservient to men. And if you let this be, then in all the kingdom, women will realize that they are equal to men and they will no longer listen to their husbands. In verse 19, it says, if it pleases the king, let a royal commandment go from him, and let it be written amongst the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it cannot be altered, that Vashti may never again come before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate to another who is better than she. When the king's decree which he shall make is published throughout all his kingdom, for it is great, all the wives will give their husbands honor, both great and small. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan, for he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to its writing, and to every people in their language, that every man should rule his own house, speaking in the language of his own people. So this is already a terribly upsetting thing, right? You have perhaps in some places a more egalitarian family unit, but now the king has decreed that won't be anymore, that men will rule the house. And this is exactly the kind of cultural shift that we see between the writing of the book of Judges and the time of Christ, right? Because the nation of Israel had been conquered by Assyria, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome. And all that time, they lived under a patriarchal culture. So that by the time of Christ, even in Jewish households, women were subjugated to their husbands because it had been the law for literally centuries by that time. But we don't see that it is the will of Christ and that this should be so in the church, because Christ not only speaks out against it, but so does Paul to the Galatians. So we know that even though this had become quite common, even in Jewish culture by the time of Christ, it was not a monolith in Jewish culture. And even today, these things are not a monolith. So now in chapter 2, before I move on, does anyone have any questions? You can type them into the chat. I've been trying to figure out how to allow people to speak if they have a microphone, and it doesn't seem like I'm able to do that here. But we'll see. If anyone figures out how to do that, definitely type in. Okay, there we go. All right, so moving on to chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was pacified, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then the king's servants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel of Susa, to the women's house, to the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women. Let cosmetics be given to them, and let the maiden who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." The thing pleased the king, and he did so. There was a certain Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. He brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was fair and beautiful, and when her father and mother had died, Mordecai took her for his own daughter. So when the king's commandment and the decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together to the citadel of Susa, to the custody of Hegai, Esther was taken into the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. The maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness from him. He quickly gave her cosmetics and her portion of food, and the 7 choice maidens who were to be given her out of the king's house. He moved her and her maidens to the best place in the women's house. Esther had not made known her people nor her relatives, because Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make it known. Mordecai walked every day in front of the court of the women's house to find out how Esther was doing and what would become of her. Now, I want you to notice something. She's been given cosmetics and a portion of food. Now, she's living in Persia, and they don't know that she's Jewish. So Is her portion of food kosher? Probably not. But she has been instructed by her father figure, right, by Mordecai, not to reveal that she is Jewish. So even though she's eating things that are not kosher, she's doing it possibly to preserve her own life. And in that case, the preservation of life is more important than the type of food that you're eating. And so this is an example of following a greater commandment, or excuse me, of neglecting a commandment in order to follow a greater commandment. So neglecting that food may be clean or unclean in order to follow the greater commandment of honoring your father and mother by preserving your own life. Right? She is the last of her household. And so if her life is not preserved, then she will not be able to follow that commandment of honoring her father and mother. But we'll see that there are some things later on that are more important even than life itself. In verse 12 here it says, each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after her purification for 12 months, for so were the days of their purification accomplished. 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet fragrances, and with preparations for beautifying women. The young woman then came to the king like this: whatever she desired was given her, to her, with her, out of the women's house, to the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the next day she returned into the second women's house to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She came in to the king no more, unless the king delighted in her, and she was called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, came to go into the king, she required nothing, but when Haggai, the king's eunuch, the keeper of the women, advised, Esther obtained favor in the sight of all those who looked at her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she obtained favor and kindness in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast for all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her relatives nor her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai, like she did when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who were doorkeepers, were angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. This thing became known to Mordecai, who informed Esther the queen, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. When this matter was investigated, and it was found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. So here, Mordecai now catches the attention of the king because he saves the king's life. Now, chapter 3, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agathite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were in the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai didn't bow down or pay him homage. Now, why doesn't Mordecai do that? And it's as simple as the second commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Mordecai, as an observant Jew, cannot bow down before Haman and pay him homage, because as it is written, as Christ cited to the devil, you shall worship God alone. In verse 3, then the king's servants who were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spoke daily to him and he didn't listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai didn't bow down nor pay him homage, Haman was full of wrath. But he scorned the thought of laying hands on Mordecai alone, for they had made known to him Mordecai's people. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even Mordecai's people. So Haman is incensed that Mordecai will not bow down before him because Mordecai is an observant Jew. And that is his reason. He is Jewish. So he will not bow down before anyone but the Lord alone. And so Haman not only hates Mordecai, but he hates Mordecai's people because of it, even though they're not there, right? He doesn't see any other Jews. He has no reason to hate them. But he hates all of them because in Mordecai's place, none of them would have bowed down. So in verse 7, it says, in the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month, and chose the 12th month, which is the month Adar. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed amongst the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from other peoples. They don't keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to allow them to remain. If it pleases the king, let it be written that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who are in charge of the king's business to bring it into the king's treasuries. The king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agathite, the Jews' enemy. The king said to Haman, the silver is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Now, the king hasn't been told who is going to be destroyed. He hasn't been told who he's committing genocide against. All he's been told is they don't keep your laws, O king who lives forever. So let them be destroyed. He hasn't even been told what laws they're keeping. But he believes Haman knows what he's talking about. So go ahead, Haman, do what you think is best. And then the king's scribes were called in on the first month, on the 13th day of the month, and all that Haman commanded was written to the king's local governors and to the governors who were over every, and excuse me, my tablet here has decided to, there we go. over every province, and the princes of every people, to every province according to its writing, and to every people in their language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and it was sealed with the king's ring. Letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to cause to perish. They didn't have a word for genocide in those days, after all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the letter, that the decree should be given out in every province, was published to all the peoples, that they should be ready against that day. The couriers went out in haste by the king's commandment, and the decree was given out in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was perplexed. Perplexed. That's an interesting word there. Why do you think they're confused about this? All right, so moving on to chapter 4. Now, when Mordecai found out all that was done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the middle of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He came even before the king's gate, for no one is allowed inside the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. Now, sackcloth is what you wear when you're mourning. And so you can't go into the presence of the king while you are mourning. In every province where the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning amongst the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her this, and the queen was exceedingly grieved. She sent clothing to Mordecai to replace his sackcloth, but he didn't receive it. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and commanded him to go to Mordecai and find out what this was and why it was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square, which was before the king's gate. Mordecai told him of all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given out in Susa to destroy them, to show it to Esther, and to declare it to her, and to urge her to go into the king to make supplication to him, and to make request before him for her people. Hathach came to Esther and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that whoever, whether man or woman, comes to the king into the inner circle without being called, into the inner court without being called, there is one law for him, that he be put to death, except those whom the king might hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. They told Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai asked them to return this answer to Esther. Now, before I read it, I want to remind you that Levitical law provides that a wife has certain rights to demand things of her husband. One of them is to be in the presence of her husband and more. But she is not under Levitical law. She is under the law of Persia, which subjugates her to the king. And so she has not seen the king in 30 days, and she may not see the king for 30 more. and she is afraid for her life if she should go and make any demand of the king, which is reasonable considering how she came to become the queen instead of Vashti. In verse 12, it says, they told Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai asked them to return this answer to Esther. Don't think to yourself that you will escape the king in the king's house any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent now, then relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Who knows if you haven't come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Now, I said before that there is no mention of God in the whole book of Esther. But consider this, that Mordecai is a man of faith, and he imparts that faith upon Esther. He tells her to have faith. There will be a Messiah. And it could be you, Esther. You could be the Messiah, the one who saves the Jews from destruction. But if you fail to do so, it could be someone else. And it could be at your expense, even as all the other Jews are saved. Because we know that it's God's will that the Jewish people continue to exist. And so deliverance will come. But I think it's interesting, this idea of redemption, this idea of the Messiah. There is Jesus, we know, is the Messiah. But that isn't to say that Jesus is the only Messiah. In other words, that redemption comes to people who are oppressed with genocide through the Messiah. And I want you to understand that exists on two levels. It exists in the physical world, that there will always be someone who brings redemption, but it exists in the spiritual realm as well, that person is Christ to those people in that time. And so there is the Messiah, but then there are also messiahs. And it works kind of like in the book of Matthew, how we see prophecy being fulfilled in its own time, but also pointing to the Messiah, right? The prophecy of David, that David would come out of Bethlehem, also points to Jesus who came out of Bethlehem. So we see that there is the Messiah, but there are also lesser messiahs, right? That this isn't a once in an eternity event. So while there is no mention of God in Esther, there is certainly a call to faith, a call to action. So who knows if you haven't come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai reminds Esther that she has a spiritual purpose to fulfill. Now, before we move on, I just want to ask if anyone else has any insights into this passage, or if you have any questions about this passage, and go ahead and type them into the chat on the right. Because there are a lot of angles at which we can view this passage. There are a lot of different ways that we can take this. And I've presented one way of viewing this as a spiritual call, even a call that echoes today in Palestine, in Ukraine, where people are facing genocide today. And who knows that God will not send them a Messiah. As Christians, we're people of the Messiah, and we're called to always be on the side of the oppressed, of those who are facing destruction. And I feel today that that is a very difficult thing to do, because we're looking at two sides and we're saying, but both sides face destruction in one way or another. How do we navigate that as Christians? And I won't say that I have the answer, but I know where to look. And so if you have any insights into this passage, into what it means today, I would love to hear your answers. And they may not be my answers, but that's okay too. We are called to struggle with these problems. Verse 15 says, Then Esther asked them to answer Mordecai, Go gather together all the Jews who are present in Susa, and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast the same way. Then I will go in to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. This is Esther's act of faith. There are some things, I said, that are worth more than a person's life. There are some commandments that if it preserves a person's life, we must put aside. But there are other commandments that even if they preserve our lives, we must put aside. Mordecai did one, right? To worship the Lord and God alone. That is worth more than a person's life. Esther does another. She gives her own life in order to save her people. She dedicates her own life to do that. That is worth more than one person's life. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all Esther had commanded him. Now, we're going to finish here. I'm just going to leave this. Some people look to the Torah, they look to the law, and we are going through the Torah. We have gone through Genesis. After this, we'll go through Exodus, and we'll continue going through the Torah. And some people consider that all commandments are worth more than a person's life, that if you would have to violate a commandment, and maybe you don't consider the Torah to be binding to Christians today. Maybe you only consider those that are echoed in the New Testament to be binding. But you consider some law to be binding to Christians today. And if you do, I invite you to ponder this. What is worth more than a person's life? Because here, Esther has to put aside a commandment. Honor your father and mother. And the next commandment, do not murder, because she is dedicating her life to something that may cost her her life, and that may end her father and mother's house, so that she can neither honor them nor can she preserve her own life. So I ask you, what is worth more than one person's life? Is there a commandment that we must follow that is worth more than ourselves? And what commandments, if any, are worth less than a person's life? Because we see here in the book of Esther, there are commandments that are worth less than one person's life. What commandments can you break? And what commandments must you never break? Go through the Bible. If you still think that we are under law, go through the Bible and decide what commandments are worth your life and what commandments are not. And get back to me on that. Go to the church website, send me an email. I'd love to know what you think about this idea that some things are worth our lives, some things are worth dedicating our lives, some things are worth being martyred, and some things absolutely are not. So that's going to be the thought that I leave you with. It's a heavy thought, I know, and I don't like leaving a Bible study on a heavy thought such as that, but I'm going to today. And that's your homework for this week. What will you dedicate your life to? What would you give your life for? And what is absolutely not worth it, even if God himself commands it? So that's where we'll leave it today. I want to remind you, this is the Restoration Church of Christ Bible study. We meet every Wednesday, 5 o'clock California time. God be with you, and I'll see you next week.